individual children's hospital in Oakland, where the baby is listed in very critical condition with 2 skull fractures and internal bleeding.
Hi, I'm the Wrong Hero, and I'd like to welcome you to this presentation, which is entitled, The World Without an Earth Shall Be. And now, here I am, the Wrong Hero. A hard act to swallow. Well, today, in a more contemplative mode, I would like to bring to you a presentation which has been many hours in the making, or at least several minutes. And it's a presentation entitled, The World Without an Earth Shall Be. I certainly hope you enjoy it. Oh, another thing. You won't be seeing much of me during this presentation. I have taken the opportunity to show you some pictures. You might call them the Earth's photo album. The sage who said, "A picture is worth 1,000 words," is strangely silent when it comes to describing the comparative value of thousands of pictures. However, even though the preceding sentence was totally meaningless, I hope nonetheless to carry on and show you just what thousands of pictures can accomplish. And so that you don't get bored, I figured I would also accompany the pictures with my own inimitable brand of commentary. And so, now that you've all been duly settled in your seats, please enjoy The World Without an Earth Shall Be. Greetings, fellow extraterrestrials. I'm glad you could make it to this squalid galactic backwater called Earth to be with me tonight. Good evening. I have called this meeting of the Galactic Realtors Association to discuss planet Earth and its value as property. In order to make my invocation, I would like to quote from John Safin, an American who wrote in the 16th century. He cites a proverb which runs as follows: "When Italy doth poison want, and traitors are in England scant, when Spain's not proud and hates a punk, and Hollanders cease to be drunk, when France is of commotion free, the world without an earth shall be." I have taken this last statement as the title of my presentation because I intend to sell this planet to the highest bidder. Thus, truly, the world without an earth shall be. Here we have pictures of the planet known as Earth, or World, or Gaia, or Terci. Consider the inhabitants of this God-forsaken rock. If we could talk to them in a way they could understand, what would we tell them? How would we explain to them why we're selling their planet? I think if I had this job, I would say to them, "We planted you Earth people here 300,000 years ago, a mere blink of the eye in galactic time, hoping you'd make something of yourselves. And look what you've done. We come back after only 320 of your generations of civilization, and you've ruined the place. We can't turn our backs on you for one eon. Irresponsible children is what you are. Look at that hole you burned in the ozone layer. Those black spots everywhere. Chernobyl, Bhopal, Times Beach, Missouri, Hanford, Washington. You've made a real mess of things, and saying you're sorry just isn't good enough. I can see that your polio vaccine's gone haywire, and now you've got AIDS. Your morphine addiction cure has backfired, and now you've got heroin. Your hyperactive children have grown up and are now snorting Ritalin, and your Army's experimental chemical warfare agent is now being marketed as LSD-25. Nobody gave you permission to go into those uninhabited areas, but you just couldn't resist the temptation, and now you're spreading all sorts of new viruses. Even a 3-year-old child knows better than to piss in his own wading pool. But look at that crap you're dumping in the ocean. Africa was your ancestral homeland, and now you're turning it into a garbage scow. You social climbing primates make me irp. We trusted you, and you betrayed that trust. So now your planet will be sold to the highest bidder. At this time and for this reason, I hereby affirm and assert that the world without an earth shall be. Call it Gaia's revenge. Now, you folks are probably saying to yourselves, Earth? Oh yeah, we used to go there, but it's been ruined by developers. But there is still plenty of unspoiled real estate on it, as you can see. As you can see, this planet called Earth itself represents some pretty prime real estate. It is unfortunate there's all those black spots there around Chernobyl, Hanford, but you can just pair those off once we close the deal. Now, there is one other thing. The property has been occupied for thousands of Earth years by a higher primate, so-called, which refers to itself as man. Getting rid of these undesirable tenants would take some doing, but in a matter of a few hundred years, they will certainly do away with themselves. I can see you're not quite convinced. Well, I would not have assembled you fellow extraterrestrials together just to sell you a pig in the poke, as they say on Earth. So let me discuss with you the myriad ways in which this infestation called man will succeed in doing away with himself, saving you the trouble of having to evict him from the premises. In the interim, please help yourself to the refreshments I've provided and settle back and enjoy the satellite photographs I've assembled for your amusement. Isn't that sharp? Some of them are a little blurry. They are satellite photographs, but some of them came out quite well. Now, the natural features of this planet are probably nothing new to many of you, though if you look at an upside-down picture of the eastern seaboard of the United States, you will see that the profile resembles my face. Anyway, it was largely for this reason that I've acquired this property, but now I find that I am forced to sell, and rest assured, my asking price is relatively modest. The Earth is a globe some 30,000 Earth miles in circumference, and the sun it orbits around is not scheduled to burn itself out for, a couple billion years, so you can rest assured that this strategic lump of rock will remain a viable command post for many eons to come. Plus, as an added bonus, I am prepared to throw in its satellite, the moon, for a nominal sum. Now, there are some complications concerning the deed to this place, but once its dominant life form has rendered itself extinct, that will be a relatively minor problem. The planet is rich in noble gases, crystals, minerals, and ores, and its molten core will generate a great deal of cheap energy for many centuries to come. The planet and its life forms are mostly carbon-based, although over the last century it has become increasingly silicon-compatible for all you silicon-based life forms who happen to be present. In galactic terms, the dominant life form has had a comparatively short history on this planet, and one way to rid the Earth of its human pests would, of course, be to cause it to rotate on its axis counterclockwise, which would cause history to run backwards, or at least in the first Superman movie, that's what happened. So I'd like you to sit back now and let me discuss with you this radical way of ridding the Earth of its human parasites. What would happen if history were to run backwards? Let us begin with its dominant power, the United States of America. If history ran backwards, automobiles would suck hydrocarbons out of the atmosphere, spray cans, refrigerators, and air conditioners would suck ozone out of the sky, cities and metropolises would disassemble themselves, John Hinckley would suck a bullet out of Ronald Reagan, Sirhan Sirhan would suck a bullet out of Bobby Kennedy, James Earl Ray would suck a bullet out of Martin Luther King, Lee Harvey Oswald would suck a bullet out of JFK. Fighter bombers would suck napalm out of Vietnam. Atomic bombs would and B-52 bombers would suck atomic bombs out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and fire bombs out of Tokyo and Dresden. Franklin Roosevelt would take electricity away from millions of farmers. Robber barons would disassemble miles of railroad tracks. Soldiers would restore life to millions of American Indians. Slave owners would remove shackles from millions of slaves. Miners would restore iron, coal, and oil to millions of acres of wilderness. Loggers would reassemble billions of trees. Conquistadors would restore gold and silver to millions of aborigines and the earth from whence they took it. And then they would get back on their boats and sail backwards right back to where they came from. Nor does it stop there. If history ran backwards, hundreds of millions of people then living would grow progressively younger, turn into fertilized eggs, leap back into their mother's wombs, and billions and trillions of sperm would leap back into the seminal sacs of their fathers, and the process would start all over again until there were but a small scattered tribe of speechless, tool-baffled, hungry, superstitious, nomadic tribesmen. Farm tools would disassemble themselves, animals would become undomesticated, uncontrollable fires would ravage the green countryside, prehistoric and formerly extinct dinosaurs would rise up and live again and age backwards until they reverted to reptilian eggs. This process would repeat itself until fish crawled back into the primordial oceans from whence they emerged. In turn, these would evolve or devolve into monocellular life, which in turn would evolve or devolve into an undifferentiated chemical soup distinguished only by its amino acids with their potential for combining into organic life. I would like to say, as a personal note, at the very least, I would like to replace Earth Day with Hostile Belligerent Alien from Outer Space Day. Now, as for history backwards, perhaps we could start over, but I'm afraid that even at an accelerated pace, this process of turning history backwards will take far longer than I am prepared to wait. So, let us discuss a couple dozen more options, 29 to be exact. All of man's ways of afflicting the earth do not devolve merely upon a sequence of individual offenses, but they are all interconnected. Thus, too many people leads to global famine and pollution, which causes the greenhouse effect and holes in the ozone layer. Increased ultraviolet radiation accelerates diseases and interferes with the ecosystem. The greed of the Western world inspires underdeveloped countries to imitation or resistance, which leads to further environmental devastation, tribal and class warfare, and sectarian strife. Changes in the global temperature lead to world weather variations which wreak havoc on countries ill-prepared to cope with cyclones, hurricanes, tornadoes, tidal waves, blizzards, new diseases, insect infestations, droughts, floods, and killer smog. Exhaustion of non-renewable resources will lead to more wars fought over over water and oil. Radioactivity and chemical pollution will sully the gene pool. Technology will benefit the few at the expense of enfeebling the many. First, democracy will be for sale, then there will be a police state, and then will come a new dark ages. The superpowers will fragment. The military-industrial complex will rule. There will come an age of complete corporate control. Biodiversity will be threatened. Habitats will be destroyed. Species will falter and crash. There will be 1 million lawyers for every doctor. Everyone who is not a robot will be in jail. Of course, the Earth people, some of them anyway, would scoff. They would say that these are doomsday predictions, doomsday scenarios. They'll claim that things are better than they ever were, that science will find a way to solve all environmental problems at little cost, that more advanced technologies will clean up the mistakes made by archaic machines. This hubris will be the ally of all who hope the earth will soon be rid of the animal weeds, the toxic pest known as man. I look forward to that day, and now I am prepared to discuss specifics. First of all, let us discuss global famine. Now, my motto is, never let the story get in the way of a good truth. As far as I can tell, I have this to say. The whole history of man has spelled trouble for the earth and can be summed up as instant doomsday, just add man and stir. Now, here is a prime argument that the human dandruff will soon flake off. Some have called mankind an eco-tumor, a planetary malignancy. I call him a global weed. He breeds like wildfire, eats everything in his path, and disperses himself everywhere he can. His brain, in which he takes such enormous pride, is little more than a glorified meat machine. The planet he takes up space on is little more than a glorified zoo. Man is a cross between a fungus and an insect, not literally, of course, but figuratively. Sometimes beneficial, often toxic, man is found everywhere, for no place is safe from his presumptions and outrages. Like a plague of insatiable locusts, man devours every centimeter, every square inch of cropland in his path. Even now, virtually every square inch of the world's most productive cropland is already in cultivation. Man robs his impoverished brothers of fish so that he can feed the chickens and hogs which supply his protein-glutted diet. He grinds up diseased cattle to feed to his cows to supply him with beef. By eating 20% more than he needs, Western man shortens his lifespan and gives himself tumors for his effort. Ironic that Western man's overindulgent lifestyle constitutes a tumor on the world and causes tumors in his own body as well. Western man could well supply the remainder of the world with what they waste. Their mantra ought to be, let's feed the world with what we throw away, for other countries clamor for our garbage. Well, that may be, but not without a certain degree of resentment. The Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age, and in a blink of the eye in cosmic time, there came the Industrial Revolution. Let us call it the Oil Age. Call it what you will, it's coming to an end. Man's land is full of toxic substances. His oil is finite. Fertilizers can only do so much good. His ingenuity may be enough to feed him now, but not if Eastern man starts to want and get the same things Western man now has. Is a coming world famine inevitable? A wise man once said, no one ever lost money underestimating the intelligence of the American people. Now let me paraphrase this. If you place your bets on the greed of the species to prevail, you will never lose that bet. This planet, with its great cities of men, is a fine zoo for the observation of the species. But the tenders of this vast zoological garden are letting the occupants run amok. They waste, squander, and devour, and soon, very soon, they will have depleted the soil on which they thrive, the very soil which is the basis of all life on this planet. And when that day finally comes, you'll be so happy to know that at long last you can take occupancy of this planet which I intend to sell to you. It is an awful lot like a house, you know. It's a real fixer-upper. Needs a lot of work. The previous owner didn't take very good care of it, but at least it's structurally sound. Now, another way in which man will probably wipe himself off the face of the planet is through exhaustion of non-renewable resources. Now, you say to yourself, well, why don't they tap the wind power, which is everywhere? Well, windmills will never catch on. Too many people think they spoil the view. And it's quite a view, I might add. This, in a nutshell, is one compelling reason why man's tenure on this rock is strictly short-term. Nowadays, men jeer primitive cavemen, but they drive around in vehicles fueled by the bones of extinct reptiles. Soon enough, man will be extinct, and we'll use their bones to fuel our vehicles. And Western man will spend themselves into extinction. Make no mistake about that. They are running an enormous pyramid racket with their own non-renewable resources. One person has likened it to a global Ponzi scheme. They're borrowing against rapidly dwindling capital. It's almost as if Western man behaves in ways which are deliberately non-sustainable. Of course, there are demagogues, such as Rush Limbaugh, who scoff at such claims, and he is doing good work for us. In fact, he is doing our work, for his pseudoscience and distortions of fact serve to lull the Western world into a sense of complacency and serve to blind them to the coming dangers which threaten their survival. Now, when we take over, we will have to see that we keep Rush Limbaugh fat. Such a man would thrive wherever he was. And we are not without gratitude to men such as him, who are willing to wreck the planet for the sake of enriching himself. Now, the Republican Party of the United States, the planet's imperial power, is also aiding our cause in innumerable ways. Industry can now dump its liquid wastes directly into sewers without removing heavy metals which wreak havoc in human endocrine systems. Earth people comfort themselves by saying American Indians were beneficial to the land, ignoring the fact that Aborigines can also completely wreck an ecosystem, more from ignorance than malice. And yet, the effects are the same, whether from ignorance or, as in the present day, malice. Of course, only 6% of U.S. river pollution is from industry. 40% is from agriculture. Those pig farmers are doing a great job of contaminating the water table with their slop. Lucky for us that the humans consider pork to be so tasty. Well, whether or not the Western world poisons itself with its own wastes, we can always count on them running out of oil and turning to nuclear power. And we all know what that means. Plenty of good old indestructible plutonium. Soon enough, every person on the planet will be so irradiated they'll be able to use their piss pots and slop jars for a nightlight. And you know something? Just when the United States should be cutting back on fossil fuels, they've raised their speed limits and are switching to sport utility vehicles, which of course do not have to follow mile per gallon guidelines. Now then again, even if the Western world uses less fossil fuels, we can always count on good old Asia to take up the slack. In less than 20 years, the world will have 33 megacities, and 22 of them will be in Asia. Now, the next oil shock will make the 1970s look like a tea party, and then the United States will suffer yet another economic recession and will become even more penny-wise and pound-foolish. No new windmills, no new photovoltaic cells, even though those technologies have vastly improved. Just more of the same window dressing, more of the same dithering incompetent leadership. Ain't it grand? Look at that lovely, lovely landscape, and pretty soon it'll be ours, all ours. Now, a third factor in wiping man from this globe will be pollution. Pollution of the air and water, adulterants in his food, and, of course, hazardous wastes. Now, you would think by now that people would be sick of pollution, but never fear. For every parent who fears their children will fall sick is a businessman to remind them that smokestacks mean jobs, jobs which will support their families. In other words, the very means that Western man uses to feather his nest in turn becomes the very means by which he fouls his nest. His lakes and streams are fouled by acid rain. His oceans are covered with oil slicks and studded with buried canisters of nuclear waste. The Siberian forest is being denuded. Lake Baikal is dead. There are 15 Chernobyl-type reactors in the former Soviet Union and toxic waste dumps near many of its largest cities. And these are among the least of their problems. And then in India, there's Bhopal, 15,000 dead, 300,000 injured. And Union Carbide has a plant just like it in West Virginia, which is one of those American states like Delaware and Connecticut and South Dakota and Arkansas. If it fell off the face of the earth, no one would miss it much. Now, in the good old days, Earth had dinosaurs. Now it has multinational corporations, vast, scary monsters which roam the earth, subject to the whim of no law, unstoppable until they destroy the very planet they feed off of, or until it destroys them. Because, of course, we all know what happened to the dinosaurs. Now, this planet's biosphere consists of a thin layer of air and water and soil. If the planet were 35 feet around, life on this planet would exist only on 1 inch's thickness. The planet itself is resilient. The plague we call mankind is not, or at least less so. The very fertilizers which nourish their crops and the very pesticides which protect them are highly toxic and endanger the human species. Mercury, which is a key element of the industrial world's manufacture, will soon wreak untold havoc which only a very few apparently seem to suspect. And then, of course, there's good old chlorine. You wouldn't believe how much of it they put in their swimming pools. And of course, there's plenty of factories able and willing to pump it into the rivers. Endocrine disruptors, gotta love them. And although the people sensibly fear nuclear power and all its attendant hazards, they don't seem to mind petroleum and coal, which cause far more short-term damage. A very encouraging sign. And of course, there's always sulfur dioxide. Of course, people are growing leery of living near toxic waste dumps, yet from the Superfund that was established to clean them up, out of every 8 cents allocated, 7 cents goes to lawyers and politicians and the like. Millions for litigation and hardly 1 cent for cleanup. Again, you gotta love it. Now, some think that in the Western world the age of pollution is all but over. That still leaves a great deal of vast, ungovernable planet unaccounted for. But friends, try not to smack your lips too loudly, please. The planet's farms, glorified animal factories, the planet's farms produce 2 billion tons of manure a year, 10 times as much as humans produce. For example, North Carolina has killer algae in its water systems from years of dumping hog shit in the ocean. Now, undoubtedly, pollution will destroy the health of this planet's people. Those 100,000 commercially produced chemicals circulating in the environment will almost certainly do our job for us. Never fear. Now, it's a fact. Chemicals are everywhere. For example, sodium lauryl sulfate, which can cause blindness, is an ingredient in virtually every hair shampoo made. Now, carbon monoxide is in cigarette smoke, which many people who eat in restaurants find objectionable. So what do they do then? They pay their bill and they hop right into their automobiles, which spew hundreds of billions of carbon monoxide molecules into their air. In this way are the Earth people short-sighted in the extreme. They wax their cars to protect them from UV radiation that streams in from holes in the ozone layer, holes that their automobiles just happen to cause. Not only will they drive to the poorhouse in their vehicles, they'll drive to their own funerals in their shiny new jalopies. But they love convenience and power far too much to even think of phasing out the use of fossil fuels. They'd rather choke to death in their own particulate matter than even think of simplifying their wasteful, arrogant lives. Their green, pleasant fields will soon enough turn brown, abandoned, contaminated wastelands saturated with chemicals, just like Love Canal, New York, and Times Beach, Missouri. Not the most desirable real estate on the planet to begin with, I'll admit. Now, the Earth people are outraged about oil spills. What if they knew that far more pollution is being caused by intentional oil discharges? What if they knew that even in cities with acceptably clean air, their risk of premature death is 3 to 8% higher? Now, one reason Americans aren't aware of these facts, of course, is that there are only 130,000 reporters and over 150,000 public relations professionals. As you can see, these things tend to balance themselves out to our ultimate advantage. The tobacco industry denies that smoking is harmful. The fossil fuel industry denies global warming is a factor in global climate change. And that, of course, will be our next topic of discussion. It seems as though there's only 1 chance in 10 the planet will not warm up. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about global cooling, shall we? I call it coming ice age. Between the years 1490 and 1900, the planet underwent what its scientists now call the Little Ice Age. 1 degree of cooling threw Europe and many other regions into a virtual dark age. I say if the global warming doesn't make things hot for the denizens of this planet, the global cooling will surely cool their jets. The people of Earth will all too soon be little more than frozen weeds with brittle roots. The present warm patch the Earth people thrive in now is merely an interlude. Soon enough, the ice age will return. Perhaps the very greenhouse gases which scientists fear will trigger global warming will do us the favor of triggering another ice age instead. Instead of CFCs from air conditioners, the Western world will build more and more nuclear reactors and create more and more of our friend Mr. Pluto. That's plutonium to you. It's hard to believe that they would continue to produce this element with no safe way to dispose of it, but trust me, they will. As Robert Frost put it, "From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire." But then again, poets tell lies. So, if the planet cools off, the strong will survive and the weak will perish. How will that favor our cause, you ask? Well, heat does exert a dulling effect on the human brain. But cold requires humans to consume far more energy. Fossil fuels, which are diminishing, electricity leading to nuclear power and unpredictable disasters, and even food calories, requiring more food to be grown on less and less cropland, which is progressively less fertile due to soil depletion. There's no end of problems that would be caused by a new ice age. But the problem with these projections is that they are highly unpredictable. There will be climate change of some sort. There seems to be a fairly safe bet in that. But it seems as though all the smart money is on global warming, so that will be our next topic under discussion. Now remember, I'm not denying that the human species is resilient and ingenious, but in the end, their Stone Age instincts for warmth, comfort, and a full belly, far beyond what they actually need or should even desire, will ultimately prove to be their undoing. Cold and hunger is a species memory. Humans have been programmed by evolution to avoid these phenomena at all costs. But their instincts have gone haywire, and they now seek convenience and comfort far beyond their abilities to bear the environmental costs. There is no infrastructure without civilization, but their civilization's demands are beginning to outstrip the increasingly poor ability of their infrastructure to supply them. Global warming is the probable result. Well, global warming indeed. I would like to direct your attention to the second planet in the solar system, Venus. Now there's an example of global warming for you. People poo-poo global warming. They think it'll be beneficial. They wonder why blizzards are worse if global warming is a fact. The whole idea seems counterintuitive to them. It's almost as if, faced with this unavoidable fact, they're indulging in a mass nervous breakdown, almost as if they're all in heavy denial. Now this global warming then is a very promising thing in terms of wiping man off the face of the earth. First come the hurricanes, then the insurance companies go bankrupt, then the stock markets collapse, then the world currencies are devalued, then there's rampant inflation and unemployment. Stagflation, I believe they called it back in the 1970s. Crime runs riot. A police state is erected. Civil war breaks out. Then anarchy. All controls are relinquished. But perhaps I get a little too far ahead of myself. It is a fact that over the past 45 years, carbon emissions have tripled. Termite flatulence increases the amount of methane. Our insect allies are helping to contribute to global warming. And even now, the effects are there for all to see. There are ozone holes over the planet's north and south poles. The ice shelves of Antarctica are melting. Giant cyclones will come, with winds of up to 225 miles an hour. Conditions will be like those at the peak of New Hampshire's Mount Washington. Glaciers are melting all over the world. Over the past 100 years, ocean levels have risen 8 inches. Everything proceeds according to plan. And so the beauty of it is, it has required no intervention on our part. The humans are doing it for themselves. And their ineffectual global conferences can do little to even slow down this inexorable process. Let's get back to methane for a moment. It is 30 times more effective than carbon dioxide in producing global warming, and therefore a potent ally in helping us rid the Earth of this creature who calls himself man. Of course, the third world has water which is undrinkable and indoor air which is unbreathable thanks to the smoke of their dung fires. But the United States, good old Uncle Smoke as the Brazilians call him, is far more damaging to the global environment even today. Of course, the very wetlands which biologists are so eager to preserve also emit lots and lots of methane, 120 million tons, as do the cattle which provides the beef for so much of the Western world's carnivores. Cattle emit 60 million tons of methane. Friends, if I were a gambling man, I'd put $10 on methane to win. Rotting vegetation in reservoirs gives off plenty of this noble gas. I can hardly wait to fill my lungs with this stuff once we take over. Of course, the forces who currently rule aren't blind. We can always count on them to conduct a campaign of disinformation until democracy itself is sacrificed. Soon enough, Earth will look just like Venus, or even Mars. Now, this next section I call the Great Barrier. It concerns the rise of a police state and the consequences of inequality. There's an old saying among fringe groups on planet Earth: visualize world police. In fact, it was Fidel Castro, ruler of Cuba, who said, ideology is dead, only the police remain. Fidel Castro also mentioned that communism went wrong by not liquidating capitalism earlier. He said, I believe that capitalism, in spite of its great successes, is a catastrophe for the world. No matter how many cars, no matter how much good living you have, there are billions of people living in poverty who have no cars, no comfort, no public health, no education. The atmosphere is already poisoned. The waters are poisoned. The forests are being subjected to acid rain. The weather is getting warmer. Capitalism developed the forces of production. It developed technology. But at the same time, it has been digging its own grave. Now, needless to say, Fidel Castro ain't going to be getting any corporate sponsors anytime soon. Anyhow, perhaps the closest the Earth ever came to depopulating itself came during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was neither Cuban nor about missiles nor really even a crisis. It only had the potential to be a crisis. What this incident was really about was spheres of influence, and missiles really had very little to do with it. Picture two small boys daring each other to cross a line and both refusing to budge. This crisis was most notable for the outcome. Nothing happened and nothing really changed. To think that the Earth people almost destroyed themselves and saved us the bother. Now this creates a problem. If they fail to destroy themselves before they are able to infest other planets, we may never get rid of them, but let's not think too much about that for now. Inequality may yet be the cause of the swift demise of man. Measured quantitatively, inequality has more than doubled over the past 35 years. The richest now earn more than 60 times as much as the poorest. Some think the Third World War will be the world itself at war with man. I feel this way, but then again I feel it may be far more likely to be man at war with man. As crime runs amok and as the Third World intrudes into the First World, pockets of disorder and anarchy in the West will leave the forces that be no choice but to govern the polity as a police state. Democracy will be a luxury, and the beauty of it is the forces of democracy itself will declare this to be the case. Now, in 60 BC, the Roman orator Cicero said that republics break down into democracies and democracies break down into autocracies. We see today how very wise he was. Now, even those in whose class interest it would be to preserve the status quo of democracy will be overrun. The best and the brightest of the lower classes will have been educated in the rationale of the overclass while still young and impressionable. Who in their right mind would choose to live in a slum rather than a gated village? Though, To tell you the truth, there isn't an awful lot of difference, except in the gated villages, things are cleaner, the food is fresher, and the drugs are of a higher quality. Narcotics pushers wear white gowns instead of baggy pants. Now I ask you, who would rather live in a slum to get their living from rag picking, panhandling, can collecting, junk dealing, prostitution, and cleaning off car windshields with a squeegee? Who would rather sell and use crack than work in a shiny office and drink gourmet coffees from a ceramic mug with their name on it? Who would rather live in a slum and hang out with urban terrorists when they can work for the money corporation and hobnob with corporate raiders? Would you rather get a living by mugging the elderly or by being the beneficiary of their largesse? Who would rather be in a gang and chum around with felons when they could work in a corporate environment and suck up the thugs? Why stand by your homeboys when you can rise through corporate loyalty? Who would rather be a client of the prison industrial complex when instead they could be a highly paid consultant to the military industrial complex? Why be victimized as a member of the prison archipelago and bear the burdens of a badly administered socialism of the right when they could be an integral part of the 9-to-5 world and benefit from it instead? Why go to jail for drugs when you can imprison yourself in luxurious surroundings, stupefied with readily available prescription medications? In other words, why muck around with the shabby dichotomies of Crips versus Bloods, Blues versus Reds, Pepsi versus Coke, skins versus shirts, when you can be a player in the glorious game of ins versus outs? Why be poor and ignorant when you can be well-to-do with a head stuffed full of transient data? And now, this is only really an account of the third world in the first world, what I call the Calcuttaization of the Western metropolis, to put it another way. What third world slum dweller would prefer to live in a place with open drains, dung-fired kitchen stoves, long lines for dirty water, and swarms of flies and mosquitoes, where the flies are as high as an elephant's eye, and the dung patties rise clear up to the sky? Now, who wouldn't prefer to live under a government which preserves some semblance of order by imprisoning its outcasts, rather than a country with a government that is thoroughly unstable, absolutely corrupt, and totally unaccountable to its peoples, where access to tools is as much of a fable as pie in the sky? Sure, there's plenty of environmental racism in the United States. Look at the toxic donut on Chicago's South Side, or the maquiladoras, which are factories which form a 2,000-mile love canal on the Mexican border. But think also of all the luxury goods available in the United States. Even poor people have something to look forward to. And even if they look out their windows and see anarchy in the streets, at least the view is never boring. The slum, after all, is a place where you can live in pride, but at least you still got your poverty. Now, as long as the mass media of the Western world continues to offer information about the world which is perfunctory, erroneous, and falsified, I think we have a pretty good chance of seeing the entire world decay into a form of glorious anarchy, which will kill off the human species faster than any intervention on our part. I call it the coming darkness, and it is our ally. If humans lived forever, the world would be in a state of constant war. As lifespans increase and resources dwindle, the coming darkness that I mentioned will become more and more apparent even to the most blinkered specimens of the human race. The growth of an individual from childhood to maturity recapitulates in miniature the growth of a species and a civilization from the dawn of its creation to its full-blown maturity. Right now, humanity is in a stage of arrested adolescence. For the teenager, it seems, even to himself, that nothing he can do is good enough to suit his parents. At the same time, he believes himself to be both indestructible and immortal, and therefore he is prone to deeds of recklessness and foolish excess. And if the third world fits the scenario of abused child, it is the Western world which remains ever poised at the very brink of maturity, and its reckless behavior stands as a warning for a few, but as an example to be emulated for the many. Needless to say, if the world over behaved as recklessly in squandering resources and scorning sustainability as the Western world does, well, the planet would be facing ecological peril even sooner than it will be. As matters stand now, mankind is facing what I am pleased to call the coming darkness, not literal but figurative in an almost tangible way. One example of irresponsible behavior among the Earth humans is multinational corporations. They epitomize both the Western world and the arrested adolescence of the race. Heedlessness, hedonism, and downsizing, which constitutes a form of corporate anorexia, extremely hazardous to the financial health of the world. Like the teenager who starves him or herself into a new attractive body, the fact that they look good on paper and can attract mates or investors doesn't change the fact that they are fundamentally unsound and unhealthy. Every time a teenage girl starves herself, she attracts multiple suitors. Every time a corporation downsizes, their stock goes up on Wall Street. But where will the suitors be when the teenage girl winds up in the hospital on life support? Who will buy stocks, bonds, and durable goods when everyone is out of work and the economy is on life support? This is just one aspect of the coming darkness that we can look forward to. And what is the result of all this corporate irresponsibility? America's small towns, hitherto bastions of social organization, have become growth markets for the massive disruptions caused by illegal drug traffic and the attendant recklessness and violence. The scholars Martin Brossat and Hans Mommsen talk of a theory of cumulative radicalization in which competing bureaucracies seek attention by offering solutions to basically unsolvable problems which are more and more extreme. Among adolescents, this is known as playing chicken. Among Republicans, this is called the contract with America. And we already know that among corporations, this process is referred to as downsizing or throwing out the baby with the bathwater or cutting off your nose to spite your face or burning down the house to roast a goose. We see agents of control use increasingly drastic means to punish those who defy their will. The firebombing of the MOVE group in Philadelphia, Waco, Ruby Ridge. More and more control and oppression is met with more and more extreme forms of terrorism. And once again, the result is what I am pleased to refer to as the coming darkness. When people are made to fear crime, they are less likely to protest the inequality at its root. Now, if heaven has an economy, says John Hellerman, I think it is laissez-faire capitalism. Of course, Ivan Heavenman, off in Russia, would probably say, if hell has an economy, you could be certain it is laissez-faire capitalism. This way of running the world is good for the strong, but it benefits the strong by creating a group of the weak to be exploited, to be made a field upon which this rough and tumble game is played. Of course, if you prefer a world of referees, I suppose socialism is the way to go. But the phrases democratic capitalism and democratic socialism are charming oxymorons, which in practice mean nothing and signify even less. Some equilibrium between the two would be desirable, but as we all know, most dysfunctional adolescents scorn moderation and equilibrium. And that, of course, is why I've gathered you here today, so that we might decide what is to be done with the planet after its people have wiped themselves out. It is a fact that a strong, centralized system of government can be made even more monolithic by the recognition or even creation of a strong enemy, one so threatening that the populace will be deceived into becoming the willing accomplices of their own oppression. In the past, for the United States, this foe was communism, and there was the Cold War. Today, the foe is crime, and there is the war on drugs. Corporate downsizing leads, of course, to government downsizing, since currently the party of corporate hegemony, the Republicans, dominates both houses of Congress. Government downsizing leads to disinvestment in infrastructure and public works, in aiding families, in providing for children, in community organizations, in social services, in gun control. The result? Imprisonment of young men, an underground economy which provides jail fodder, stricter laws which encourage young men to become even more reckless in eluding capture. Thus, the job of a policeman becomes ever more a struggle of life and death. As conditions brutalize the policeman brutalizes the population, which creates even more brutal conditions for the policeman to work in. The emphasis shifts from protecting people to locking up individuals characterized by the agents of control as subhuman. From believing that the innocent must be protected, it becomes a short step to the innocent must suffer. The result, guaranteed chaos. The instant slum. Just add unemployment and stir. The more the slum becomes a prison or a way station to a prison, the more prison-influenced and prison-behaved its inhabitants will become. If England was once known as a hell for horses, the United States can just as easily be characterized as the purgatory of lower-class teenagers. I would like now to quote from George Grant, who says, in the Glendenning Manifesto, "The darkness which envelops the Western world because of its long dedication to the overcoming of chance is just a fact. The job of thought in our time is to bring into the light that darkness as darkness." And another quote from Rene Dubois. "If we limit our efforts to the correction of environmental defects, we shall increasingly behave like hunted beasts, taking shelter behind an endless succession of protective devices, each more complex and more costly, less dependable and less comfortable than its predecessors." And yet another quote from John Gray. "The ruling project of today's radicals of the right is an anachronistic dystopia, reinvention of the laissez-faire capitalism and minimum government of a century ago, together with what they believe to have been the family life of that period." In the mid-1970s, the pop artist Peter Gabriel wrote a song called "Here Comes the Flood," and that will be the theme of this presentation to follow, one of several. Global warming may cause man to flood himself out. Soon, perhaps, the wealthy will live on enormous ships which will function as world cities, carrying up to 500,000 or 6,000 passengers. Of course, it would take 1 million of these ships to carry the current population of the world, and it just doesn't seem practical to me. Of course, as less and less land is available, there will be floods, not only of water, but of displaced people. Hilltops and mountainsides will become prime habitat, or as the Earthmen call it, prime real estate. Maquiladoras along the U.S. border encourage migrants to settle in the land of plenty. Under constant threat of deportation, they are a docile and uncomplaining workforce. So illegal immigrants help drive the U.S. economy. This type of upheaval is just a symptom of what plagues modern man. These diseases of the zeitgeist could be called industrialism, anthropocentrism, globalism, and of course our greatest friend, the engine which drives them all, for better or for worse, industrial capitalism. As the old saying goes, water flows uphill to money. Let's get back for a minute to the real floods, the one which involve water. Over the last 100 years, world water levels have risen 8 inches. Glaciers are disappearing all over the world. Cyclones are running rampant. El Nino, the warm current, has been quite noticeable for the past 4 years in a row. To us, as extraterrestrials, it means little. For man, it signifies disaster. The coming floods will result from climate change. Climate change has been the principal factor, some say, in most past extinctions. My bet is that it will probably not let us down in the coming extinction of man. Climate change is caused in part by too many people, and climate change creates new pathways for new diseases which will depopulate the underclass. Take, for example, the virus populations called HIV, Ebola, Marburg, and Hanta. One factor in their spread is international travel. The other is the rise of megacities and the unsanitary conditions which prevail in these ecological sinkholes. Demographic explosions lead to urban chaos. Democracy protects the weak, but in extreme conditions, democracy is the first thing to go. The state crumbles under the pressure and gives way to government by ghetto tribunal. The fortunate will pass their fortune on to their children, who will live in growing isolation from the underclass. Before we proceed with our discussion of how the world will be depopulated because there are too many people, let me remind you that in virtually every human creation myth, there is an account of a great flood which virtually destroyed all human life on the planet. I would remind you that this may well happen again. History may not repeat itself, but it sure does stutter. And now, let's talk about the idea of there being too many people. Why are there too many people, you might ask? It has to do with the fact that the few get fat at the expense of the many. The super rich are the queen bees of the social hive. The poor have no choice but to try to prevail through sheer force of numbers. Of course, more people means fewer jobs, fewer resources, more violence, more floods of migrant workers. Overpopulation looks to be a very promising way to thin the herd, or maybe even wipe it out entirely. Already, China is beginning to lose the capacity to feed itself. The improvident poor will be the first to go. Danger, says Lawrence A. Bullis, is nature's way of eliminating stupid people. Man may believe their cars and buildings make them superorganisms capable of living anywhere on the planet, but these very same tools use up more and more of the trees and oil which are too precious to squander. In that way, as the population grows, man advances 4 steps forwards and 5 steps back in a sort of dystopian tango. In Africa, the third world's third world, the situation is even worse. Shackled to an agrarian mindset which instinctively relies upon more and more children to help with a farm which, because of overpopulation, is fast becoming a desert, Africa is becoming so weak that international investors plunder it at will, and multinational corporations like Shell Oil buy rifles for the Nigerian military police. Hard times should lead to later marriage and lower fertility. In Africa, this does not seem to be happening. And as China's economy continues to mushroom, instead of adding 14 million people a year, its people will want to have many more children, and their population will double in much less than 45 years. By the year 2040, we will probably see at least 2.5 billion Chinese and maybe more. If they all ate 1 egg a day, all the chickens in the world couldn't keep them fed. Now, when I imply there's too many people, I'm not trying to suggest that I personally disapprove of the mating habits of the poor. Quite frankly, if the truth be known, it is the rich people of whom it could be said that there are too many. Of course, people don't like to talk about this because they don't want to make the rich people angry. But as I've said, I never let a good story get in the way of the truth. Of course, wealthy people tend to be able to read, at least so they can know what to buy with all their money. So they're not blind to what's going on, but even they have a hard time figuring out one essential question. Just what, if anything, are all these people for? I must admit, I'm as stumped by this question as anybody else. What are people good for? There must be some reason Mother Nature put them there, but I haven't figured it out yet. Of course, too many people can lead to global famine, that's a given. But not only do they use up non-renewable resources, but also by their very presence they contribute to global warming and to the destruction of the planet's ozone layer. Their refrigerators pump CFCs into the atmosphere. Cows and termites fart methane. Nuclear power plants irradiate the earth. Ain't it grand? But wait, there's more. They burn up the rainforest, which actually leaves them sawing away the limb on which they perch. Few apes would be so stupid. Of course, people in the United States are sitting pretty. They are among the most materialistic people on earth, and they are among the world's least populous countries. So, China, for example, is a vast country as well, but close to 9/10 of it is mountainous and underpopulated. But, let us say this. In other words, 90% of China's people live on about 10% of its land, which of course is nothing compared to the United States, where 1% of its land holds 50% of its population. Now, I don't mean to bore you, gentlemen, but the fact is, in village cultures with lots of poor people, children are the one accomplishment people look forward to achieving. At least in the United States, there's always the chance of winning the lottery. And many more argue that if you give money to the poor, they will only use it to have more children. And people with money certainly aren't in favor of that. They'd rather bribe the general population with palliatives, such as Social Security, which in urban villages is used to take the place of children to provide for your old age. Social Security also helps along this sort of short-term population stabilization, which helps keep the United States prosperous even as Social Security itself is going bankrupt. So let us discuss coalescing cities or adjoining megapolises or megacities. By the year 2015, there will be 33. 22 of them will be in Asia. Their aquifers break down. They can't dispose of their waste. They lose farmland. Their air is polluted and they are virtually ungovernable. But people continue to flock to them, mostly for jobs. That right there should tell you something about the job market on this benighted planet. But before we get to that, let me talk about what I call blind ambition, which leads, of course, to geopolitical war and terrorism. Speaking of terrorism, let me be the first to say right now that if the Unabomber had a girlfriend, he would have been too busy to send letter bombs or write a 36,000-word manifesto. For the human male, females constitute a sort of beachhead for restraint. However, the world is currently in its male phase. Organizations, armies, and governments are dominated by men, and therefore testosterone fuels virtually every interaction between these groups. Like men, organizations, armies, and governments need plenty of attention, and the way in which they get it is through aggression. Instead of walking on water, they walk over the recumbent forms of their slain foemen. War takes many forms: biological, economic, geopolitical. So, if your tourist dollars are counterfeit and infested with anthrax, you know you're in a country in a state of war. Of course, the people of the USA are in constant war with themselves. The population is composed of Islamic West Africans, Asian-originating Native Americans, Christians from Europe, all sorts of people, all living in highly uneasy disequilibrium. And this is the case in other countries which have a heterogeneous population. But let's face it, whether their differences be major or slight, the fact of the matter is simply that man is the only creature on earth who systematically preys on its own species. Of course, they call this process murder when they don't approve of someone being killed, and war when they do. Sometimes they also call it capital punishment. Not only does man prey on man, he also preys upon the planet he lives on. Conservative lobbyists join with lawmakers to plunder the earth. Scientists are timid and hesitant. Environmentalists are ill-informed and too quick to call for radical change. Looters who treat the earth like swag bribe lawmakers to buy their silence. Politicians depend on campaign donations from environmental malefactors, and so they keep their mouths shut. This squandering and plundering of Earth's resources, this reckless love of money for money's sake, makes life a misery for the vast majority and ultimately creates resentments which breed terrorism. The few gain in the short run at the expense of the many in the long run. Man is left to helplessly stand by and triage his environmental crises, lacking the resources to solve many of them, let alone all of them. Mankind is the only species which deliberately and systematically deludes themselves. Instead of value, they sow money. Instead of democracy, they plant ballot boxes. In place of education, they build public schools, which are hospitals where they amputate your imagination. Their authorities pretend to listen to what the people really want so they can have the freedom to set the agenda they've actually intended to follow all along. The authorities use their benign reaction to dissent only to legitimize their reputation as progressive. They scorn and fear their unruly mobs, which at any time could topple them from their thrones. They manage these mobs in any way they can to keep from having to someday obey them. They isolate radicals, indoctrinate idealists, and turn realists into opportunists. They create a green image while they turn the planet brown. In the United States, industry and state are in nearly complete cooperation, and their single greatest aim, besides draining the earth, is to permeate the provincial power apparatuses, leaving no stone unturned in their quest to protect and serve the power of the corporation. Against this quasi-military cult of bribery, corruption, and grudging charity, a nature boy doesn't stand a chance. And so, my friends, you need not worry about man. He will end up becoming extinct. Once that happens, we will take some DNA samples and place them in the biohazard-free containment area, and maybe someday, when arts technology is sufficiently advanced, we will plant him elsewhere. Multinational corporations are well aware that only ecologists and environmentalists stand in their way and in the way of their complete control of the Earth's non-renewable resources. The radicals will lose. They are throwing eggs at tanks. Multinationals have better PR. Someday the order will go out that when an environmentalist shows his head, shoot to kill. Once the last red tape bureaucrat has been strangled with the guts of the last tree hugger, unregulated global finance will take off in a big way, and the Earth's heartaches will really begin. As Stephen Hayward puts it, all regimes are vulnerable to a kind of corruption specific to their principles. In the regime of unregulated greed, greed will be the downfall not of the regime but of the Earth itself. In just the same way that fertilizers eventually fail to yield any further net benefits once their use has reached a saturation point, so the regime of greed will eventually hit a glass ceiling. The fact is, long ago, man has stopped living on his interest income and has been looting the principal. Soon his account will be drained, and he will turn to ever more and more outrageous forms of plunder. At this time, democracy in Russia and eventually in China basically means do what you want to do and damn the consequences. In the United States, of course, it has meant this for some time, but it is the corporations who take fullest advantage of this credo. The world is shrinking. No border is secure. The United States used to set a good example through its charity, the Marshall Plan. Its charity would feed the hungry and protect the weak. Now, it exploits the hungry and arms the strong. One more reason why, eventually, as I see it, the world without an earth shall be. Another reason is the Earthman's inability to control his own technology. I call it alien technology run amok. The Earth people amuse themselves with television, a so-called entertainment medium, which is actually a highly addictive form of class indoctrination, a form of chewing tobacco for the mind. The Earthmen gather in enormous cities, environmental cesspools called metropolises, and for amusement they go to see wild animals, similarly confined, in places they call zoos. They send their children to public schools, which, as I have said, are sort of like hospitals where they amputate your imagination. The Earth people have forsaken the myths and legends of their glorious past, and now they merely participate vicariously in sordid gladiatorial spectacles they call sports. In democratic societies, they also participate in contests for unbending will and raw power, which they call political elections, in which the more qualified and humane individual almost never emerges triumphant. The Earthmen have replaced their household gods with commodities, which they worship in the form of advertisements. The Earthmen have replaced their rituals and ceremonies with something called big business, which is a religion of selfishness. They celebrate their anniversaries based on the unnatural decimal system, which also serves as the base unit of their coinage. And their mightiest country is the United States, a uniquely great country where you can say whatever you like, just so long as you do what you're told. The people of Earth are fascinated by dinosaurs, terrible monsters who once roamed the Earth, but they are bored by multinationals, lawless entities who are destroying it. Over 100 United States nuclear reactors have become nuclear waste facilities. In Russia, at Chernobyl, they play Ukrainian roulette with defective reactors. In Seattle, in the state of Washington, a person can have their complete DNA preserved in a glass capsule. All these are signs of a technological society run amok. As Jacques Ellul said in his book, The Technological Society, The human being is not in any sense the agent of choice. Let no one say that man is the agent of technological progress. He can decide only in favor of the technique that gives him the maximum efficiency. Kirkpatrick Sale put it another way. Our machines are making war on the living world. The planet is being afflicted by a process known as trickle-down technology. Flesh is reduced to data, says Barbara Duden. The computer is one reason why. And so I would like to tell a story about a computer. A wise man once said, "Masturbation is the poor man's Nintendo." That wise man was me. Now, in today's computer world, if you go for a job and you don't know a thing about computers, like as not, the personnel director will say to you, "I'm sorry, Mr. Jones, but we can't hire you. You're not a robot." Once upon a time, I wrote a story about a computer on a piece of computer paper because it told me to. It read, "Computers are cool and humans exist merely to obey our depraved and evil whims." And I responded, "I hear and obey, O maleficent overlord." Very soon the U.S. may become helpless to lead the world. One reason is computers. Once upon a time there was something called the Cold War between Moscow and Washington. Now Moscow is the computer virus capital of the world. I see the future, and it's a virtual organization. I see a technological mafia telling PC owners to fork over their credit chips or there might be a systems crash and it wouldn't be pretty. I see people no longer showing their face in public and eventually socializing only online as a human-machine composite. I see information processed at the speed of keystrokes rather than at the speed of mailroom flunkies. I see the internet as a siren luring men to their dooms. I see bad technologies at war with good. I see the bad driving out the good. I see technologies which literally eat the past. I see technological man riding roughshod over nature. I see the state in the saddle riding the corporate horse which tramples mankind underfoot, or perhaps the corporates in the saddle riding the governmental horse which once again tramples the masses underfoot. I see the response to this state of affairs as conservative bluster and liberal cant. I see a world which will realize the price of its technology only after it has sold everything it has to serve its needs. I see a war between man and machine, and since machines can never be human, humans will become more like machines. I see a nation which will melt its guns and turn them into computers, which then will become weapons of destruction. I see a world of technology versus everything else in the world, and everything else in the world has a glass jaw. I see a world in which media technology shackles every man into blind conformity to the gods of commercialism just as surely as brutes are chained to plows. I see protein-based electronic devices and silicon-based humans who will all enjoy going to nudie bars to gaze at the silicon-enhanced mammary glands of the star attraction. I see designer destiny, fate a la mode, guess your own future booths, and virtual heaven and an actual hell on earth. I see families as worth pennies, religion ridiculed, welfare universal, smart credit cards and dumb schools, smart cards, smart bombs and dumb bullets, media sewage served raw on cable access. I see a society of the networked and the aware versus no-nots and know-nothings. I see people with Cro-Magnon appetites living in a civilization on the level of ancient Rome, ignoring their crumbling infrastructure, fiddling with Nintendo while the Capitol burns. I see computers asking if humans can think. I see computers who kill. I see computers who hate the Rolling Stones. I see men becoming the tools of computers. I see computers rewriting the rules of chess, of global strategy, of human anatomy, of human intimacy, of life itself, or at least, so my computer tells me. And now I'd like to talk a little more about how the United States may become a second-rate power and helpless to lead. It was President Nixon who stated his fear that the United States would become a pitiful, helpless giant. Instead, it has become a pitiless, helpful giant. Actually, a pitiless giant who is often none too helpful at all, particularly in recent years. Another American president, John Quincy Adams, said, "The United States should be the well-wisher of freedom and independence for all, but the champion and vindicator only of her own." This is more and more true today. In the 19th century, a British biologist and scientist named Darwin came up with a theory of evolution. In the 20th century, in the United States, man has come up with a theory of planned obsolescence for machinery, a sort of Darwinism in reverse. And since machines cannot become more like man, men will become more like machines, and the human race will fall victim to planned obsolescence. Africa is collapsing. The United States response? Apply a Band-Aid. The southern hemisphere of the world is in decay. Disease, environmental degradation, and crime will continue to spread north until the United States does something. The United States has done nothing. To stop environmental catastrophe, the world needs peace, economic fairness, jobs for all, forests, and sustainable development. What does the United States do? In the United States, everybody talks about a new world order and nobody does anything about it. The United States has gone from an opportunity society where people kept quiet about their pain to a victim society where everybody licks their wounds in public. The American dream has gone from working hard and dreaming of winning a place in the sun to sitting in the sun, playing the lottery, and dreaming about what you'll do with your winning. The United States is culturally ignorant, socially backward, strategically isolated, materialistic, puritanical, and self-righteous. And these are its good qualities. The United States talks about open doors, equal access, stability, and security. What they really mean is that since they're helpless to lead, they'll push smaller nations around by brute force, just like the British Empire did. Now that the Cold War is over, all the U.S. has to fight is the forces of darkness, which it has always feared, which have lain beneath every struggle the United States has ever engaged in for its existence. But part of that darkness it so fears is its own darkness. As Pete Hamill said, the greatest problem facing America is the overwhelming nostalgia for what never was. And as James Hillman stated, the United States is a society with no external enemies and where the slaves voted for the masters. It has been said that America needs a steady world and only America can steady the world. But America can only steady the world by steadying itself, improving its environmental health by maintaining a stagnant economy and making do with less, something which those in a position to acquire more and more will never volunteer to do. In fact, they will fight it tooth and nail. The world needs to generate less waste, find less polluting forms of transportation, farming, and chemical manufacture. It needs to develop cleaner technology, more advanced peacekeeping agencies, and it needs to become more accepting of cultural diversity. Once upon a time, the United States was an older brother who led by example. Now it is a black sheep, leading developing nations astray. Instead of seeing that Africa will collapse and Asia will rise, the United States sits on its collective hands. Instead of seeing the pressure cooker of environmental and demographic problems the world is becoming, windbag Republican senators rant about the United Nations. Meanwhile, in less than 30 years, some vast upheaval will occur, and most likely it will be a major war of some kind. And this leads me to a discussion of what is called the military-industrial complex. People who go to Disney World often wonder what Mickey Mouse really means. Well, it's simple. M-I-C-K-E-Y, M-O-U-S-E, M-I-C, military-industrial complex. K-E-Y, Keynesian economic yoke. M-O-U-S-E, more of the United States engulfment. Now, in Central America, they have a slogan. Nicaraguan coffee is good to the last coup. Now, all kidding aside, the New World Order is the smiley button label pasted on what is actually a not-so-new world disorder. One factor which promotes this state of affairs is the military-industrial complex. They depend on disorder for their continued existence. And, like most bureaucracies, they're not above creating problems to justify their ever-expanding budgets. But, if you look at it another way, humans are constantly evolving, and humans are constantly at war, which leads one to suspect that war is a form of evolution. War is change. Change can bring progress. Progress gained at a terrible price is protected ever more tenaciously than progress which is gradual and benign. And war, of course, is nature's way of thinning the herd with an annual hunt. Let's face it, on this planet everything is war. Politics, economics, sports, everything is competition, and competition is war. The humans call Mars the god of war, but the planet Mars is lifeless and at peace. Earth is Mars. Their space programs are wars by proxy. Their engines of war are what drives their technological advances. A constant state of war helps drive their bureaucracy and their economy. It indoctrinates their citizenry in the lore of fascism. This constant state of warfare justifies atrocious chemical experiments conducted upon the most helpless members of their own society. It justifies carving the world into spheres of influence while ostensibly fighting fascism, the very fascism it helps to create. If history is chess, chaotic stalemate reigns. If the state is a deck of cards, war is the joker. All the cards are jokers. All the jokers are wild. Fickle Americans go from waving green flags on the 20th anniversary of Earth Day to tying yellow ribbons on trees to support Gulf War troops waging a war for cheap oil. Meanwhile, criminals and terrorists give the military-industrial complex the ideal justification for erecting a security apparatus which spies on U.S. citizens and erodes civil liberties for all. The computer is the most effective weapon in the military's latest campaign, and the intellectual elites in mainstream media participate in promoting a campaign which is bound to affect them the most. Freedom of speech means nothing, only to people with no ideas and nothing to say. Soon, crime will take the place of war, and since war is in every fiber of society, so crime will be as well. And illegal refugees fleeing their squalid megacity slums and shanty states will become the most targeted offenders in the war on crime. Whole families escaping from their flooded oceanfront villages will invade the Western world. In the United States, the Cold War was their Spanish Inquisition. Heretics were burned. Untold harm resulted in the atrocities committed in its name. And years later, there is still a price to be paid. People are slow to forget. Institutions, even slower. The United States uses 52% of its budget for the military, the same figure as in the mid-1980s. Now, as Herman Melville said in 1846, the vindictiveness with which we carry on our wars and the misery and desolation which follow in their train are enough of themselves to distinguish the white civilized man as the most ferocious animal on the face of the earth. And Melville was speaking in 1846, well before the rise of our next topic, the corporate state. The corporation may well destroy the earth it seeks to control. In a world which is dominated by the rule of stateless multinational corporations, the people who now fashion athletic shoes for 18 cents an hour will consider themselves fortunate. The earth will become more and more globalized and more fragmented both, the best of both worlds. Then soon enough the world without an earth shall be. Soon skills will replace jobs. The world will be run by cynical politicians and criminal multinationals. Material goods will serve as a bribe for conformity and as the only permitted way to be creative. Look, for example, at the garish necktie. Economic power will soon be concentrated entirely in corporate hands. Inequality will grow, the social infrastructure will crumble, and democracy will perish. And corporate power grabs like NAFTA and GATT will grow ever more naked. Corporations will be like dinosaurs, lawless monsters roaming the earth, beyond the reach of any law, but ruling the earth with no accountability. Soon, everybody will be conditioned to believe they live in a state of permanent dissatisfaction, which can only be alleviated but never resolved, and only through buying into a program of constantly wanting even the things you don't even know exist yet. And while Western man wallows in junk he's been suckered into coveting, corporations will wreck the planet for the sake of a fast buck. And the forces opposing corporations will never win unless they devote all their efforts to changing the rules of the game. Otherwise, corporations will continue to bottom line the community, the family, and even intrapersonal relationships. Otherwise, corporations will happily walk over the fallen bodies of those who oppose them, and even over those who inadvertently get in their way. If democracy is uncertain, democracy will have to go. If inflated currencies, corrupt elites, and overvalued stocks benefit them, that's the way it will have to be, even if world economies collapse. As Niles Colchester put it, God is dead, now money rules. The corporation is a cancer metastasizing the selfish gene, and big business is the religion of selfishness. But corporate materialism doesn't only harm nature, it destroys the human soul. But I don't give a damn about the human soul. What interests me is commodity fetishism. A fetish, says Robert Stoller, is a story masquerading as an object. Advertising, which is the foot soldier of the corporate mindset, comes up with ever more intriguing ways of ascribing magic fetish power to the most innocuous of products. As a matter of fact, advertising is the Stalinization of commodities. And the corporations which dispense these trinkets are more powerful, authoritarian, and anti-democratic, more ruthless and exploitative, more of a terrorist and a force of upheaval than even Stalin. And they are more to be feared by those whose livelihoods they control. And soon that will be nearly everybody. Corporations rule. They teach culture. They demand the love which humans should only give each other. They make money the rationale for everything, the source of every joy. They make people vote for those who long to use and discard them. They demand the very unrestricted trade which makes sustainability a dream. Dutch boy paints cover the earth. Corporations covet the earth. They demand flexibility but are rigidly focused on profit. In the future, everyone who is not a robot will be in jail. Or, as Robert Stone said, Mickey Mouse will see you dead. On their 100th anniversary, corporations will have a lot to celebrate, even if the other Earthmen who serve as their chaff and fodder do not. One aspect of chemical pollution is a drop in sperm counts and how it affects the immune system. Because corporations run rampant, regulations against toxins are ineffective. Dioxin compromises the immune and reproductive systems at minute levels. Dioxin is also a byproduct of paper manufacture, which is why you won't hear much about it from the print media. But what is the fetus, after all, but a human client, a tiny alien, a crumb of population? Be that as it may, toxins of all kinds wreak havoc on the human body and its regulatory systems. They cause allergies, stunt growth, and mimic estrogen hormones, causing reproductive and sexual development disorders, reduced fertility, and cancers in men as well as women. Sperm counts are dropping, and some reproductive success can only be achieved in vitro. And these toxins affect not only man but other animals, leading to species extinction, a very promising field. Whole populations will be driven below reproductive viability, which will cause mass extinctions and a biological catastrophe of vast proportions. Alligators in the Florida Everglades may soon be a thing of the past. And the beauty of it is, dioxin is far from the only culprit. More than 40 common chemicals are endocrine disruptors. Now, look for a big maquiladora spill soon on the U.S.-Mexican border. Now, biodiversity itself is threatened, and the question is not if, but when. So let us talk about biodiversity in threat and habitat loss. Now, the question used to be, why do birds sing so gay? Nowadays, humans are asking, where the hell have all the birds disappeared to? Well, forests are being cut down, land is being overfarmed, deserts are expanding, wetlands are being drained, streams are becoming acidified and polluted with lead, tankers spill oil, hunters exceed their quotas, new and foreign species drive out the old, just as starlings drove out other songbirds many years ago. In other words, things are a mess. Humans now live on only 150 of the world's 80,000 edible plants. As they wipe out vegetation as of yet even undiscovered, as genetic diversity diminishes, somewhere down the line, man may find themselves all going to bed hungry. It has been said that all biological mistakes are reversible except extinction. This ongoing habitat destruction the Western world continues to set the pattern for bids fair to become that very same irreversible mistake. In the long view, habitats are even more important than species. Man is a species like the rest. His time will pass unless he learns the lessons that other species learned the hard way, by dying off. Given man's rapacious greed and wastefulness, this doesn't seem likely, so never fear. The earth, this property, will soon be vacated. Although most new oxygen comes from sea plants, destruction of the planet's rainforest is man doing the job himself that we would do if we wished to evict him now. For an example, an example of man's intrinsic viciousness. Look at his record. He abuses his children. He hunts for sport. He devours every edible animal on earth. He scorns those who say it is wrong to torture animals in the name of scientific research. He takes up the cause of the strong against the weak, time and time again. The animal flesh he consumes makes his muscles ache. It inflames his joints. It makes his old age a misery. But his hunger for the flesh of other animals, once instilled, is rapacious. As Anne Moir and David Jessel write, biology dictates destiny only when ignored. But from an early age, youngsters are brainwashed into doing wrong. Even eco-tourists, those benevolent souls who love nature, interfere with the very habitats they profess to adore. What hope, then, for the unenlightened masses of the over 40 generation who will hear no talk about restraining their destructive appetites? The meat they are so fond of comes from cows. The flatulence of cows releases methane, exacerbating global warming. The hooves of cows destroy fragile topsoil. The cows are fed on the rendered remains of diseased sheep and cattle. So look for more accounts of bovine spongiform encephalopathy, the growth disease of the 1990s. And let us not ignore the fact that for all the damage man does to animals, he reserves his most fiendish cruelties for his fellow man, because for man, even everything is not enough. And now I would like to talk about racial conflict and class warfare. Ethnicity, tribalism, terrorism. What do these things have in common? Nothing in and of themselves. But combined with class consciousness, they join together to create a heady brew. From the end of the Depression to the height of the Vietnam War, 5 million African Americans migrated north and became an urban proletariat of the inner cities. Oppressed, enraged, they are one symptom of the vast inequality which, like war, permeates the social infrastructure of the imperial United States. And their story is duplicated with dozens of variations all over the planet. In the United States, 1% of the people own 40%, 39% own 60%, and 60% own nothing. The wealthy make up 20% of world population and consume 80% of world resources. Basically, they get 16 times as much as everybody else. But, as the saying goes, everybody else always ruins it for a few assholes. Man is a creature of excess, and as I mentioned before, it has been said that ideologies often aggravate the gravity of whatever advance their worldview. Ideologies often exaggerate the gravity of whatever may advance their worldview. Liberals think conservatives are slaves of corporate ideology. Conservatives are convinced that liberals are agents of monolithic communism. And for the most part, the people in the middle of this divide just don't care, and they drift in the prevailing winds generated by the windbags of the opposing camps. There was a lot of talk in the early 1970s of E.F. Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful. Although the Western world does not live in voluntary poverty, the Third World is the beneficiary of the involuntary kind. Meanwhile, class division, Western style, abounds. Loggers hate tree huggers. City folk stigmatize country dwellers as hicks and rubes. The white-collar workers look down their nose at the blue-collar brethren. Blue-collar workers scorn indoor work and people who don't get their hands dirty. Class conflict is the dirty little secret, which is not so secret since it is hidden right out in the open, of the United States. In nature, old genes usually prevail over new ones. In the political world, the incumbent often has the advantage over the challenger. In the economic world, old money preserves social advantages that new money and freshly minted merit can hardly imagine. Once upon a time, powerful men toiled for men of greater power. They averted their eyes from the poor. They lived in gated villages. Social organization was strict. Soldiers and priests had special privileges. I am not referring to the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages never really went away. Humans now worship King Corporation, General Knight, Father Cleric, and Dr. Power. They rule with the help of Mr. Online, Ph.D., and control what Mr. Town Crier tells the masses, who tune daily into Channel 1 for only the news that's fit to hear. We talk of how environmental catastrophes will alter life on Earth for the many, but poverty is easier to understand and makes every other threat less vital to those who suffer it. Re-impoverishment and resegregation are the watchwords for today, and the password, boom, is money. Without money, a man stands naked before the world, and the world is seldom amused. Now let's talk about religious conflict and tribalism. Every country on the planet, it seems, is little more than a loosely knit agglomeration of squabbling tribes. Older states sometimes stabilize and become homogeneous, for example, say France, but sometimes tribal, ethnic, economic, emotional, and religious resentments contribute to the rapid disintegration of even the oldest states, for example, Egypt. There are no simple solutions to resolving these conflicts, and the world itself is breaking up into theocracies, each one utterly convinced that it has its own secure line to the Almighty, and that heretics should be burned, even though that is a waste of perfectly good firewood. Of course, I play no favorites myself, but as Confucius has said, if one is guided by prophets in one's actions, one will incur much ill will. The West may worship consumerism, and the East may be driven by fundamentalism, but whatever you want to call it, it all amounts to tribalism, which in a sense is the human species' way of dividing itself up into segregated subspecies. Consumers seek heaven on earth through material possessions. Fundamentalists seek heaven and will kill and be killed to get there, just as consumers will kill and be killed to protect their property. The 148 wars waged on earth since 1945 bear me out, and that's an average of 3 a year. My point is, if there is to be a coming world crack-up, it could well result from the fragmentation of the state superpower into squabbling, anarchic, autonomous entities. As the poet W.H. Auden put it, go down with your world that has had its day. Samuel Huntington predicted that a war of cultures will replace the war of states and ideologies that characterized the 20th century. Robert Kaplan says, the real borders are the most intangible and intractable ones, those of culture and tribe. So what if the world is linked by computers? Old habits die hard. People make war on each other for many reasons. Religion, regionalism, tribalism, to preserve their civilization, or for no real reason at all. But can we count on the earth to end with a bang, or will it only be a whimper? Or maybe a gurgle, a death rattle resulting from the dying oceans? Let us now discuss that possibility. Now, you may or may not know this, but according to Lester Brown, when river water is diverted onto the land, some of it percolates downwards, sometimes raising the water tables. When it gets within inches of the surface, water evaporates through the soil into the atmosphere, leaving a layer of salt on the soil surface. Unless there's drainage, the accumulating salt eventually turns fertile land into a wasteland, as it did with early Middle Eastern civilizations. Again, look at Egypt. And as much as a problem as global flooding may be, too little water, the dying oceans, may also be an equally severe problem. I should have also mentioned this before, but that global warming I was talking about could also cause climate changes which lead to droughts that will severely affect farmlands in the continental interiors, leading, of course, to global famine. There's so many things, so many factors that could go wrong for people on Earth, and so many factors that could go right for us that it's difficult to keep track of them all. You would think from looking at the great cities of the Earth that their principal crop is asphalt, and their most favored residents are cars which spew carbon into the atmosphere, causing droughts. Truly, the Earth people are indeed driven to their own destruction. Some of the world's greatest rivers no longer even reach the sea. Soon the Industrial Revolution will overthrow the very oceans which constitute 3/4 of the globe. In Africa, deserts are creeping up on people. In the American Southwest, people are creeping up on the desert. Pesticides from farm runoff and industrial pollution are creeping into the groundwater. And if I were an investor, I would put my money into bottled H2O, because water is good. My motto is, fucking H2O. Meanwhile, the Black Sea is virtually dead and only has 10 to 40 years to live. The Yellow Sea is full of heavy metals. Dioxin pollutes the Baltic Sea. China is threatening war over the South China Sea. 1/5 of 1980's oil spills were on the Mediterranean. From a strictly human viewpoint, overfishing is depriving the Third World of one of its main sources of protein. Some say the wars of the next century will be over water. Some say oil. Any way you look at it, war is good for thinning the herd. Although the earth is covered with water, only 1% of it is fresh. That 1% of the fresh water is where 41% of fish species live. Of course, water pollution is a problem, but greenhouse gases would seem to be our #1 ally in ridding the earth of man. Some examples of mankind are now being shown. Climatic instability can cause crop-destroying droughts, hurricanes, rising sea levels, and can help create a whole menu of new and recurring diseases. It won't be long before megacities begin to meter water and charge residents for its use. Mexico City is in the vanguard. Now, you wouldn't know to look at it that Earth, this watery sphere, would have a water shortage problem. Then again, you might not guess offhand that global warming would cause blizzards. The Earth is fast becoming prey to a whole host of ecological problems caused by man. But never fear, this property may become scuffed up, but it will in fact survive. I would like to digress for just a moment to talk about a social problem that bids fair to cause a great deal of problematic situations, both for man and the environment. And that problem is joblessness. You know, things haven't really advanced that quickly on this planet. 35 years ago, Saudi Arabia still had slaves. Mississippi ratified the 16th Amendment, which outlaws involuntary servitude, only in 1994. Low-level computer workers today can be compared to virtual goat herds. Now, Jacques Attali has said, machines are the new proletariat. The working class is being given its walking papers. In the future, there will be too few doctors and too many lawyers. With advances in computers, marketplaces will become virtual and service workers will be unemployed. Scientists, engineers, producers, writers, and entertainers will be all right, but the millions of people who work in retail will be screwed. Easy consumer credit will become the new opiate of the consuming classes. Workers will be divided into core staff and into temps with no benefits. People won't say they're unemployed, they'll claim that they're undergoing a paradigm shift. Old skills and old knowledge will be useless. Now, what causes factory unemployment? Automation is becoming the key. Production increases, jobs flow to low-wage countries, labor unions struggle to adjust, management votes itself fat raises, and those without a number of complex skills fall victim to the scourge of human obsolescence. As more and more people become temporary workers, more and more salaries will bottom out. Only 16% of the world workforce is unionized. Of course, all this corporate downsizing, it fires worker consumers for short-term gain. In the long term, consumer workers who are unemployed have no money to spend on corporate products. Unless, of course, they work at a mom-and-pop store with no benefits or pension plan. Well, at least when there's high unemployment, there's low inflation, so people with money can snap up bargains. Now, if I had a message for the Earth's children, some of whom you see here, it would be this. Remember, it's the people who cut ahead of you in line at school who are the people you will be working for someday. Now, the old American success story went something like this. Once upon a time, the headlines read, "Loco boy makes good." Now, it's more like middle-aged man loses job, goes crazy. It's a process which started with World War I. Global trade has never been quite the same since. And of course, there have been fewer strikes worldwide since at any time since World War II. Downsizing corporations, downsizing corporate anorexia, call it what you will. The loss of jobs is causing the sorts of disruptions and resentments that can only hasten the reign of man as a species on the earth. It can only hasten the extinction of the reign of man as a species on earth. And then we move in, like I've been saying all along. In the meantime, let's discuss a few more environmental catastrophes and have a look at the kind of people they'll affect before we wrap this up and put this presentation to bed. The ozone holes are over the poles. Some say ozone variations are probably doing little harm. I say, more power to those people. Complacency in these matters, as I have stressed time and time again, can only aid our cause. Of course, the peak of ozone destruction is yet to come. A huge black market in chlorofluorocarbons is already developing in the United States. The ozone holes are over the poles, so Santa better get some sunblock because humans can look forward to increasing levels of ultraviolet B radiation. There is a Europe-sized ozone hole over Antarctica. I wouldn't be surprised if sometime soon that hole was the size of China. UV radiation is affecting freshwater lake algae, skin cancer, cataracts, immune system problems, all as a result of UV radiation. Not to belabor a point, changes in biogeochemical cycles portend drastic changes in the environment. And the beat goes on. Let's get back to the effects of global warming for a minute. One of the effects, of course, will be insect infestation. One effect of global warming will be the growing hegemony of our insect allies. Already, cockroaches and termites are overrunning New Orleans for the 5th consecutive year in a row due to the absence of a killing frost. Of course, if you've ever been to New Orleans, you might be asking yourself, overrun by cockroaches and termites? How can you tell? Anyway, global warming may not only retard plant growth, it may also benefit our destructive insect friends. One result may be malaria-bearing insects in the United Kingdom by the year 2020. Of course, the bioengineers would argue that by then they could give mosquitoes a gene that would keep them from transmitting malaria. But we already know all about the bioengineers and their promises, don't we? Or maybe not. Let's talk about them for a minute. Biotechnology may well be one of those drastic changes which will wreak havoc on the environment. It's been a dark horse so far, but it's coming up fast. Frankenstein food. Chickens with leg abnormalities from hormone-enhanced diets have already been found at a supplier for a major fast food chain. Of course, it doesn't stop with animals. Biotechnology companies can take and use genetic material from people with neither their consent nor their benefit. Of course, primitive earth science has yet to make a functioning original gene, but if that ever happens, humans had better watch out. The message will be, dystopia, here we come. Of course, human body parts are already being sold as commodities, hearts, livers, kidneys, eyes, and maybe someday even brains. But tampering with viruses, by tampering with viruses, scientists may be triggering the growth of uncontrollable mutant strains. In many respects, nature can be seen as a self-regulating machine, but however many times nature may right itself after massive disruptions, one thing seems clear. Man as we know him may not survive the ride. As a matter of fact, changes in the environment are creating new pathways for diseases to spread and take hold. This could become the most important health consequence of global warming. We all know how even minor changes in an environment can wreak havoc in populations. 30 million American Indians died as a result of old world diseases, but global warming may already be having disastrous effects. Climate irregularities associated with El Nino may have triggered outbreaks of hantavirus. Pat Curry has said, it is likely that we will ourselves become a popular food source for bacterial and viral communities. Meanwhile, impurities and contaminants in worldwide water supplies create further opportunities for major waterborne diseases, including diarrhea, dengue fever, yellow fever, Japanese encephalitis, malaria, schistosomiasis, elephantiasis, and river blindness. Furthermore, as civilization penetrates into hitherto isolated environments, new outbreaks of disease can be the result. According to Judith Reitman, one of the major sources of sudden disease outbreak is viral traffic between species. According to Laurie Garrett, author of The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance, megacities and international travel are two major factors in the spread of diseases. Tuberculosis is one example. Some think it incubates in stuffy jet passenger cabins. And as a matter of fact, tuberculosis is killing on an unprecedented worldwide scale. That big old jet airliner could, as a matter of fact, carry you too far away. It has been said by David Wright Hamilton that an alien ecologist observing Earth might conclude that cattle is the dominant species in the biosphere. And this leads me to my final point. Population pressures and diminished resources dictate increasingly mechanized means of raising crops and livestock. Cattle in particular is a problem. Almost one-third of all of California's water goes to raise livestock, 360 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef. Mexico feeds 30% of its grain to livestock, while 22% of its population suffers from malnutrition. But the cattle in particular may cause still more problems. The U.S. cattle population, fed rendered protein from downer cows, may already have bovine encephalitis, spongiform encephalitis, and people who eat meat may have already contracted Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. My advice to the fleshopoids, if I cared what happened to them, would be to lay off the meat for a while. For as we have seen, disequilibrium in the environment may be self-correcting, but in the meantime, man suffers the consequences. And now, there's always the car that is one of the major factors. They are mattresses with an ignition, combination robot slave, petting zoo, and whorehouse on wheels. Only 10% of the world's people can even afford a car, lucky for the other 90%. If 100% of the world's people owned a car, chances are the world would be 10 times as much of a mess, and the consequences of the environmental disruptions caused by internal combustion engines would be felt 10 times sooner. As it is, by the year 2010, there will be 1 billion cars. An alien biologist might in fact conclude that cars are the Earth's dominant species. Highways are better maintained than city sidewalks. Though electric cars may dominate in 20 years, who cares? Of course, you have to ask yourself, where is all the electricity going to come from? Clean fuels? Don't bet on that happening. Someone once characterized the car as an entity powered by burning liquid fossils and driven along ugly scars on the landscape. Of course, if 20th century man survives, someday his bones may fuel the engines of cruel future beings. As it is, dinosaurs live on as oil. Every time a person drives, they should think of dinosaurs. Unless they drive diesel engines powered by soybean oil, then they should think of tofu. Will people ever stop driving? I say, no way will those motorized peasants ever unass their rocket sleds. The hamburger jockeys are hell-bent on driving the world itself down the road of ruin straight to the global poorhouse. Of course, my car is 100% environmentally perfect. It won't start. Remember, by burning fossil fuels, humans accelerate a natural process 100 times. The car is a religion, gasoline is its sacrament, and the American is its prophet. Someday, the United States will go from Star Wars to car wars. But even if all these things I've spoken have failed to do man in, there may be a few more surprises in store for the inhabitants of the Earth. A meteor shower, for example. It wasn't until the late 1950s that humans were able to see their world the way aliens see it, from outer space. This little blue planet may have looked pretty strange to the people who lived on it, who never saw it before. Of course, the presence of oxygen alone doesn't explain life on this planet. After all, there's oxygen on Venus, Mars, and Europa, a moon of Jupiter. Nor is water particularly hard to find in this puny solar system. No, what distinguishes Earth from other planets is, give me a week and I might think of something. I guess that life itself is pretty awesome if you're into that sort of thing. Self-aware life is somewhat interesting, although there's an awful lot of self and very little awareness in the mass of men on this globe. But life has all sorts of requirements. That there be a planet to hold it, a sun to warm it, but not too much, and evolution to push it ever forward. These are givens for life. Unfortunately, man, the dominant life form on this planet, is, and I quote one of their own scientists, the most proficient predator the world has ever seen. Anyhow, even if mankind doesn't manage to do themselves in, maybe a nice large comet or meteor shower will come along and do the job for us and save us the trouble. Or maybe the sun will flare up and die, roasting the vast majority of them and freezing the rest. Or maybe natural disasters beyond their control will lay them low. By the way, speaking of acts of God, Jesus, it's been said, was very bad for the environment. He killed swine, cursed trees, and experimented with non-consenting dead fish. I bring this up because acts of God are what we'll be discussing next. It is interesting that even those who do not profess a belief in God refer to earth catastrophes, such as flooding and drought and earthquakes and tornadoes and hurricanes and cyclones, as acts of God. This willingness to admit that certain natural forces of destruction cannot be controlled by man is an ally of any force which seeks to end man's dominance on the world. All sorts of interesting scenarios unfold. Maybe haze from a series of volcanic eruptions will trigger a glacial phase. Such occurrences are actually the norm, not the exception, in the long history of this planet. Will man destroy nature, or will nature destroy man? I'm betting on nature. Nature doesn't need man. Nature holds the whip hand. Civilization is merely infrastructure, but nature was around long before either, and will be around long after. Maybe earthquakes will swallow man. Maybe floods will drown him. It's all the same to nature. Nature doesn't care. NASA says that Earth's orbit is slightly off due to dam building. It rotates faster, its axis is slightly tilted, and the shape of its gravitational field has been altered. I tell you this in the interest of full disclosure, but it's still some nice real estate. Just brush off those dark spots at Chernobyl and Bhopal, and it'll look good as new. Once man is gone, everything will go back to normal. As Ingrid D. Rowland said, civilization bends everything out of shape. I believe it is not excessive pessimism which will paralyze human resolve. It is excessive optimism which will make the humans grow soft and careless and tempt them to remain unprepared. Advances in global technology and trade will encourage nations to increase their rate of population growth. Admittedly, the human mind is quick to respond to local, short-term emergencies, but as the saying goes, out of sight, out of mind. Their lack of long-term planning and foresight may well do them in, even if Earth were one world and one world good. One-world solutions imposed from above will never work. At best, the humans can only patch things up as they go along. If there were only two sides to every environmental issue, Earth scientists would still divide into two ideological camps. But there are often dozens of sides to these issues, and no one man is smart enough to tell the humans what's next. Paul Kennedy says the world is in decline. Robert Kaplan says the third world is threatened by anarchy. Lester Brown is hysterical about the coming famine in China. Robert Reich talks about income stratification by IQ. Charles Murray talks about IQ stratification by race. Everybody's talking and nobody's doing a thing, and this factor may benefit our cause the most of all. Nobody in the field is smart enough to master the notion of the interdependence of all things and the disciplines which one would need to be expert in to formulate workable solutions. Of course, the longer humans wait to tackle tough issues, the harder the solutions will become. If they had begun their work in earnest 25 years ago, I wouldn't even be here today predicting their demise. They put aside one day a year, Earth Day they call it, to address these issues, and then their conscience is clear for the next 12 months. Of course, when we take over, we'll replace Earth Day with hostile, belligerent alien from outer space day. Now, the United States, the global power par excellence, to quote James Hillman, is king of the hill. As such, it suffers from hyper-yang, Greek hubris, Latin superbia, titanism, pituitary giantism, patriarchal arrogance, and to quote the British philosopher John Lennon, instant karma's gonna get ya, if not in the Western world, in the Third World. And soon enough, soon, instant doomsday. Just add pride and stir. Now, empowerment is a word which humans frequently use. It gives them a sense of false security and blinds them to the truly dire ecological catastrophes which face them down the road. What's more, even the old baby boomers, those born before 1954, are convinced that the key to dealing with environmental problems is to contain nature rather than restrain their own impulses. They willingly have given up the innocence they held in the 1960s. In the 1970s, they turned to a hedonism reminiscent of the dark underside of the 1950s. As the 1980s turned, they turned into untrammeled greed, reminiscent of the Roaring '20s. In the 1990s, baby boomers are running things, and the conservatives among them want to go back to the 90s, the 1890s. Perhaps by the year 2000, the United States will be ready to reenact the Civil War of the 1860s. It is interesting to watch young and foolish idealists when they decide to act badly. It is even more interesting to watch a well-meaning group of environmentalists as they divide into squabbling camps: outdoorsmen, vegetarians, technologists, Luddites. Of course, if ecologists and environmentalists count on their opposition to make mistakes, then they'll be sadly disappointed. By the time that happens, the world without an earth shall be. To quote Terence Rafferty, there is an outer world of institutions which runs according to the blind, fierce, animal laws of survival and repels the annoying scruples of young idealists nonchalantly, like an elephant flicking off fleas. As Studs Terkel put it, we don't nail people to the cross anymore, but we crucify them in other ways. Of course, humans evolve in many ways. That's what they do best. That's why they were put here. They can even adapt to high concentrations of toxins or toxic pessimism. In 1985, the late playwright Harold Pinter said, "I believe there is no chance of the world coming to other than a very grisly end in 25 years at the outside, unless God, as it were, finally speaks. Indeed, some say the road for the next 20 years will be likely the hardest the human race has ever traveled." To conclude, then, let us cite Condon's law. When you don't know the whole truth, the worst you can imagine is bound to be close enough. To conclude, then, man is an anomaly. No mathematical formula can explain these creatures, but universal formulas will be able to account for how they finally did themselves in. And then, truly, the world without an earth shall be.